Hey everybody, Corey here coming at you with another knife video. Today I wanted to go over my quality and design knife checklist. These are the things that I look for as soon as I pull a knife out of the box to make sure that it is manufactured well from a technical perspective, from a mechanical perspective, and also that it's actually designed well from a usability perspective. This is actually an update to a video I made about a year ago when I was relatively new to the hobby, and some of my tastes have changed. Some of the things that I look for have changed, so I just wanted to put out a new video in that regard. So without further ado, let's jump into it. The very first thing that I look for when it comes to a knife out of the box is what I refer to as the trifecta. That trifecta is the relationship between blade centering, action, and blade play, right? Because as everyone knows, you can loosen a pivot to the point where the action just falls shut and there's so much blade play that it's just absolutely ridiculous and the knife is borderline not safe to use, right? So the Mako, the DEF CON Mako, is a good example of me illustrating this. Right now, it's at a point where it is essentially perfectly centered, it has a great action, and it has absolutely no blade play, right? But what I can do to illustrate this, I'm going to loosen the pivot a little bit, and you'll see as I loosen the pivot, pay attention to that tip. You can see the tip has moved and it is now favoring the show side. What that's going to do for me is going to give me a quote-unquote better action. You can see that it just swings shut at this point. Boom. But the problem is, one, the blade isn't centered, and two, I have so much blade play that the blade is basically clicking between the scales. That's not good. So what I want to do is tighten that pivot up to the point of making sure that the blade is once again centered, which right about there, it looks like it's centered. The action is still good, very good, and that there's no blade play. Right now I can tell there's just a little bit of blade play. I'm going to tighten it again, just a little bit. There's now no blade play. The knife still drops shut, and it is still well centered, okay? So that's what I'm looking for. I don't necessarily need a knife to be perfect out of the box, but in my opinion, a good knife should be, or at the very least, you should be able to make it perfect by simply adjusting the pivot a little bit. If a knife still has problems when the pivot is fully tight or a little loose or whatever after you tinker with it, I'm not a big fan of that. So that's what I refer to as the trifecta. Next thing I want to talk about is fit and finish. And for this one, I want to give the example of my Reich 1902 BCF. And oh, look at that. You can already see what I'm talking about. Right there, you see that little mark in the titanium? So functionally, it doesn't really do anything, right? There's no problem with the knife just because it has that mark in the titanium. However, it is a fit and finish issue straight from the factory. This knife came to me this way from the factory, and in a perfect world, with a perfectly manufactured knife, that mark wouldn't be there in the titanium. Similarly, take a look near the pocket clip right here. You see this silver piece, this hump that is not flush with the pocket clip? I have no idea what that's all about. It looks like it just wasn't machined out properly, but you can see on the other side of the pocket clip, there's nothing there. It's completely flush, right? So that tells me maybe something was missed here. If it wasn't missed, if it was designed this way, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me because it clearly looks unfinished. Again, this isn't something functional. It doesn't affect the functionality of the knife, but it gives me an idea of how much care and how much attention was put into the assembly, the design, the manufacture of the knife. So that's the next thing I look for, are issues with the finish, whether it's just cosmetic or whether it's actually structural. Another thing from a fit and finish perspective, I'll move this out of the way. Let's take a look at my Best Tech Ascot. Now, this one is a good example of this. So when we take a look at where these two pieces meet, right? You've got wood down here and you've got like a G10 carbon fiber combination up top. What you can see where they meet is that there's just a very tiny gap. And on this side, I would actually say I don't really have anything to complain about here. When you run your hand over it, you basically can't even feel it. However, on the other side, you can see that there's actually a gap right here that's big enough to where it has collected gunk. That white stuff in there is basically dead skin from my thumb from handling this knife. you know, given that this is a $100 knife, I might not necessarily expect this to be perfect, but it's the kind of thing that I'm definitely looking at when we start getting into higher price knives. If you're going to do something like this, there is no reason that it shouldn't be just perfectly flush. It needs to be perfectly flush. That's all there is to it. If you can't execute it, don't do it. Great. So that's the next thing that I'm looking at. Next up, let's talk about blade grind. This is another fit and finish topic. So here is my ProTech Malibu. You can take a look at the bevel right here, and you can see that the bevel is essentially even from heel to tip. It might not be perfect, but it's pretty much even from heel to tip, and even thickness. However, when we take a look at this side, now, this is confirmed. I talked to ProTech. This was an issue with the Blade Show 2021 edition models. I don't know why. I can't fathom why it was, you know, unique to these ones, but it's a good example. Look at how thin the grind is by the heel. Look at how thin the grind is by the tip. Look at how fat it is in the middle. Somewhere in the process, they just grinded the hell out of the middle of this knife. Eventually, that is going to impact cutting performance. Now, again, it's still a knife. You can still make it sharp, but this uneven bevel, I mean, when I go to sharpen this, I have to meet either the thickest portion of the bevel, or I need to grind the knife back and reprofile it. And that's gonna be really annoying with 20 CV. So that's just another fit and finish thing that I like to consider. After that, let's start talking about design. I also try to assess the knives from a design standpoint. And again, the ProTech is actually a pretty good example for what I want to show next. Let's talk about sharpening choils and finger choils, but specifically sharpening choils. If you're gonna put a sharpening choil in your knife, you need to put it in a place where it has passed the point where the knife is reducing itself in thickness, past the point of the plunge grind. Because what you can see here on the ProTech Malibu is that we're actually starting to develop a smile. The grind is getting a little bit thicker up here towards the inside of the choil, and that's because the knife is still thinning out at this point. Because the steel is a little bit thicker here, as this gets sharpened, you have to sharpen away the thicker portion of the steel in order to hit the edge. That's when you start to develop this thing that people refer to as a smile. Look at another knife, for example. Get the Bestech Ascot back out. Sorry, I need two hands for this. You can clearly see, boom, the plunge grind ends right there. I will never have to think about the thickness of this sharpening choil right here because it exceeds the plunge grind. I can just sharpen the edge of my blade and it's always going to be fine, and I'm not going to develop a smile until I get all the way up here, which is basically never in my lifetime. That's a design thing. That's something that needs to be thought about when the knife is being made. One other thing that is an example of design. Let me close this. Again, I need two hands, I'm sorry. Let's talk about a deep carry pocket clip. Got some graphite on there. Deep carry pocket clip. Now, most of the time, I don't like complaining about pocket clips, but if you're gonna do a deep carry clip, you need to do a deep carry clip right. The ProTech Malibu is an example of a knife that does it right. You give me a deep carry pocket clip, and you also give me deep carry screws. The screws are recessed into the scale of the knife. What that means is that the screws are not interfering with your pants as you slide this into your pocket. That might not sound like a big deal, but let me show you. This is my Off-Grid Knives Scorpion. This is an example of a knife that could do this better. They use button head screws instead of recessed screws, and sometimes what I find is that my jeans get hung up right here because they can't go to the bottom of the knife, they go to the top of the screw. If your pants are thicker than this space right here, you're going to have to shove them that final ½ an inch to actually make use of the deep carry pocket clip. I don't care about this on a knife that's not deep carry because that's not the point of the knife. It's not going to be deep carried anyways. But if you're going to give me a deep carry pocket clip, you better give me the clearance that I need to get it all the way into my pocket. Otherwise, what's the point? You know, I'm going to be mad at this knife every single time I have to shove it into my pocket because the screw is interfering. Finally, from a design perspective. And these are not my only design checks. This is just to give you an idea of the kind of common sense stuff that I look for when I'm paying attention to a knife. Let's look at the Chris Reeve Knives Umnumzan. I actually just put out a review on this knife and I talked about this. This lock bar, it's just ridiculous to me. Look at this hump. Look at this point that the lock bar comes to. Look at how thin that lock bar is at that point. All that does right away, when I grab this knife with my index finger, and this is exactly where I want to, you see, I can't really choke up anymore on this knife. Look at where that thing is. It is just burying itself into my index finger, and there is just no way around it. It is not comfortable, and I think about it every single time I use this knife. I'm still not fully convinced that Chris Reeve actually put his seal of approval on this knife. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. This is a common sense mistake, in my opinion. I have no idea who grabs one of these and doesn't experience the issue that I'm experiencing with this from an ergonomics perspective. Again, no, I don't go on every single knife and say, okay, let's look at the lock bar now. But these are the kinds of things I pay attention to, and these are the kinds of things that make me worry. I say, man, if they didn't think about this, what else is going on throughout this knife that they might not have put enough thought into? So essentially that's what I'm looking at. We're talking about a good action, good centering, no blade play. We're looking at finish, literally the finish on, say, the handle, the finish on the blade. We're looking for gaps between parts that shouldn't have gaps. We're looking at a blade grind that makes sense, a blade grind that is done well, that is even from heel to tip. We're looking at good sharpening choils that won't interfere with your sharpening job. A deep carry pocket clip that has recessed screws, knives that just don't have ridiculous hot spots on them, things like that. That is the checklist that I typically go through with a knife. Let me know if you guys have anything else that you look for specifically in a knife, because, you know, for the most part, really what I care about is that trifecta. If a knife can have a good action with good centering and no blade play, that's like 90% of the way to me enjoying a knife, and the other 10% is ergonomics. So that's all I have for today, guys. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it useful, and I will see you guys next time.